The night had been quiet until the door to the speakeasy creaked open. Jerome sat at table 7, his back to the wall, the low hum of conversation around him barely registering. He had always been a man who could blend into the shadows, someone who thrived in the quiet corners of Harlem. But tonight, something was different. The air felt thicker, more oppressive. Every breath seemed to come with a warning. His hand trembled as he reached for his glass, his mind wandering back to the past, the 11 years he had spent trying to outrun it. The memory of Bumpy Johnson, the man he had betrayed, haunted him. 11 years, 11 years of freedom, or so he thought. He had left Harlem, carved out a new life, made new connections. He had convinced himself that the past was just that, past. A distant memory buried under layers of time. But in the back of his mind, he always knew no one ever truly outruns Bumpy Johnson. And tonight, as the door opened and the dim light spilled into the room, that truth slammed into him with the force of a freight train. Bumpy stepped into the speakeasy, his presence undeniable, his reputation preceding him like a shadow. The crowd fell silent. Jerome froze, his glass suspended in midair, his heartbeat suddenly deafening in his ears. Bumpy Johnson, after all these years. Bumpy's eyes scanned the room, pausing for a moment on Jerome. There was no recognition, no emotion in his gaze, just cold calculation. For a split second, Jerome thought he might escape again. Maybe Bumpy didn't recognize him. Maybe the years had done what he hoped they would. But the moment passed, and in that fleeting second, Jerome understood. There was no escape. Not from Bumpy, not from the consequences of his actions. Bumpy walked across the room, his movements slow, deliberate. The kind of walk that commanded respect. The kind of walk that told everyone in the room that the king had arrived. He stopped in front of Jerome's table, the sound of his footsteps reverberating through the silence. Jerome stood up, his hands clammy, his voice caught in his throat. Bumpy, 11 years, Jerome. Bumpy's voice cut through the silence like a knife. 11 years you thought you could run, thought you could get away. But I never forget. I never forget what you did. Jerome's mouth went dry. His mind raced, his body frozen in place. 11 years. He had been free for 11 years. The money, the new life, the escape, all of it had felt real, like it had been a new chapter. But it was all just an illusion. I didn't mean it, Jerome stammered. It was a mistake, Bumpy. I thought I was just trying to survive. Please, I didn't want to hurt you. Bumpy didn't flinch. Hurt me? His eyes narrowed, his voice cold. No, Jerome. You didn't just hurt me. You betrayed me. You sold me out. You sold out everything we built. For what? A few $1,000s? You thought that would be enough to erase what you did? Jerome's hands shook, his throat tightening. He could feel the walls closing in. Please, Bumpy, let me explain. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I thought I had no choice. You always have a choice, Bumpy responded sharply, his gaze unwavering. But you made the wrong one. You broke the code, and in my world, that's unforgivable. You don't get to break the code and walk away. The silence that followed was deafening. Bumpy's presence filled the room, and the weight of his words hung heavily in the air. Jerome could feel his heart racing. The years of running, of hiding, of thinking that time had erased his past. All of it had led to this moment. Bumpy reached into his coat pocket, and the room seemed to hold its breath. When his hand emerged, the razor gleamed under the dim light, the edge sharp and unforgiving. Jerome's breath caught in his throat. He had seen that razor before. It was Bumpy's tool of justice, his instrument of retribution, and tonight it was coming for him. "Bumpy," Jerome whispered, his voice barely audible. "Please, Bumpy didn't respond. His eyes locked onto Jerome's, cold as steel, unblinking. Slowly, methodically, Bumpy stepped forward. He raised the razor, and in that moment, the entire world seemed to slow down. Jerome's heart pounded in his chest. The time for running had passed. The time for excuses had ended. There was no escape now. And then, in one swift motion, the razor flashed. Bumpy Johnson was more than just a name. He was the embodiment of power, respect, and loyalty in Harlem. Born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1905, Bumpy's rise to prominence in Harlem was nothing short of legendary. By the time he became a man, Harlem was already a battleground, a place where the strong ruled and the weak were prey. But Bumpy didn't just survive in the chaos. He thrived in it. His reputation was built on a simple but ironclad rule: loyalty above all else. Those who aligned with him, those who worked under his watch, were bound by this code. Loyalty wasn't just a virtue. It was the foundation of everything Bumpy had built. Betrayal, on the other hand, was an unforgivable crime, and the price for it was steep. Bumpy's empire was vast, stretching from the streets of Harlem to the corridors of power in the city. He wasn't just a gangster. He was the king of Harlem's underworld, a man whose name inspired both fear and respect. Politicians, police officers, and businessmen alike knew that crossing Bumpy Johnson was a one-way ticket to ruin. He didn't need to play dirty. He had his own code, and that code made him untouchable. But it wasn't just power that made Bumpy the man he was. It was his sense of justice. He had built an empire based on loyalty, and he enforced it with a cold, unrelenting hand. When someone crossed him, when someone betrayed him, the price was always paid. And no one, not even those closest to him, was exempt from the consequences. Jerome had been one of those men. Once, he had been a trusted ally, a friend of Bumpy's who had helped build the empire. But when the opportunity came, when the price was right, Jerome betrayed that trust. The lure of money and a chance to escape Bumpy's shadow had led him to sell his old friend out, to turn his back on everything they had built together. 11 years passed, and for those 11 years, Jerome thought he had escaped. He had lived in relative peace, building a new life far from the streets of Harlem. But the past, as he would soon learn, is never truly gone. The streets have a way of remembering, and Bumpy Johnson was a man who never forgot. Jerome had been living a life of freedom, or so he thought. He had started over, built new connections, found new friends. He had convinced himself that he was beyond the reach of the man he had betrayed. Time, he believed, had erased the wounds, had faded the memories of that night. The money had been enough to bury the guilt, or so he hoped. But deep down, Jerome knew he would never be free. There was always a lingering sense of dread, a nagging feeling that Bumpy's hand was still out there, waiting to reach for him. Every time the phone rang, every knock on the door, every shadow in the corner of his eye, it all reminded him that the past wasn't something you could outrun. Not from Bumpy Johnson. As the years passed, Jerome had let his guard down. He had convinced himself that Bumpy had forgotten, that he had moved on. After all, it had been 11 years. But now, as Bumpy stood before him, The truth was undeniable. Bumpy had never forgotten. The betrayal had never been forgiven, and the time for reckoning had come. Bumpy's footsteps grew louder as he crossed the floor, and each step felt like a drumbeat echoing through Jerome's chest. The crowd was still, as if they too understood what was unfolding in the moment. The inevitable reckoning had arrived, and there was no escaping it now. Jerome tried to steady himself, his hand gripping the edge of the table as though it could hold him together. He could feel sweat pooling in his palms, his mind racing for any last-minute plea, any excuse that might save him. But deep down, he knew there was no escape. Bumpy had spent years building a reputation, a system of loyalty, and tonight it was coming to a head. Jerome had tested that system, and now it was time to pay the price. "Bumpy, please," Jerome whispered again, his voice thick with fear. "You don't have to do this. I've changed. I've made something of myself. Please, I didn't want to hurt you. You have to understand, I had no choice." Bumpy's gaze locked onto him with the coldness of a man who had long since passed the point of reasoning. "No choice?" he repeated, his tone ice-cold. "You made a choice, Jerome. You chose greed. You chose betrayal." Bumpy took another step forward, bringing the gleaming razor closer into Jerome's line of sight. The sharp edge of it seemed to reflect the very essence of the streets, dangerous, unforgiving, swift. It was as much a part of Bumpy as the respect that followed him wherever he went. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about enforcing the code, a code that had no room for betrayal. "You don't understand, Bumpy," Jerome pleaded, his voice rising with desperation. "I was just trying to survive. You were on top, you didn't see it, but things were changing. I had to think about myself." Bumpy's eyes darkened as his lips curled into a slight frown, and he tilted his head slightly. "Survive? By betraying me? By turning your back on everything we worked for?" He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "That's not survival, Jerome. That's cowardice." Jerome's breathing grew erratic. He felt his body beginning to tremble as the severity of Bumpy's words settled into his bones. He had betrayed a man who had given him power, respect, and opportunity. And for what? To save his own skin? For a quick payday that never seemed to last? His mind flickered to the moment he decided to make that choice. When he had walked away from Bumpy, from Harlem's underworld, convinced that money and a fresh start were worth more than loyalty and honor. But all these years later, the weight of that decision was more suffocating than any prison. And now, here Bumpy was, the very embodiment of the justice that had been postponed for over a decade. Bumpy raised the razor again, his voice quiet but forceful as he spoke. "You were my brother, Jerome. But when you sell out your own, when you cross a man who's given you everything, there's only one way to deal with it." Jerome's mouth was dry, his voice barely above a whisper. "Bumpy, please." But Bumpy wasn't listening anymore. He had already made up his mind. This wasn't a matter of mercy. This wasn't a moment to be swayed by words or pleas. The consequences were long overdue. In a flash, Bumpy swung the razor down, a sharp, calculated motion that cut through the tension in the room with the precision of someone who had done this countless times before. The blade struck across Jerome's cheek, slicing through the skin in a clean line. The room seemed to hold its breath. The only sound, the sharp hiss of Jerome's breath, as pain bloomed across his face. Jerome's hand flew to the wound, clutching at his cheek as blood seeped through his fingers. His body shook, his knees weak from the searing pain. His mind was spinning, the realization that the life he had built, the freedom he had thought he earned, was all gone in an instant. There was no undoing what had been done, no excuse that would save him from the consequences of his actions. But Bumpy didn't stop there. He stepped back, his eyes never leaving Jerome. There was no need for words anymore. The lesson had been taught, and the price had been paid. As Bumpy turned to leave, Jerome remained rooted in place, his body racked with pain, and his mind struggling to come to terms with the finality of what had just transpired. The world around him seemed to spin as the blood continued to drip from the gash, a reminder of the price of betrayal. The room was silent, the rest of the patrons still too stunned to move. No one dared to speak, to even breathe too loudly. They had witnessed something that few ever did, the brutal, cold execution of justice, and the reminder that in Bumpy Johnson's world, loyalty was the only currency that mattered. As Bumpy exited the speakeasy, the weight of the moment lingered in the air. Outside, the night felt quieter, like the city had exhaled in relief. For Bumpy, this was business. For Jerome, it was the end of the line. And for the rest of Harlem, it was a reminder, one that they wouldn't forget anytime soon. The men who had watched the confrontation unfold felt the truth of Bumpy's actions settle within them. There was no negotiation, no second chances. The streets of Harlem had their rules, and anyone who dared break them faced the razor's edge of justice. Jerome's name would be spoken with a sense of finality, not regret. He was the one who had betrayed the man who had given him everything. He was the one who had broken the code that Bumpy had built his empire on. And for that, there would be no forgiveness. In the aftermath, Harlem's streets grew quieter once again. But the respect for Bumpy Johnson's unyielding justice only grew. His reputation as a man who enforced the law of loyalty was reaffirmed, and the men who followed him understood one thing more clearly than ever. There was no place for betrayal in Bumpy's world. The message had been delivered with the flash of a razor, and no one who walked these streets would forget it. In the days following Jerome's reckoning, Harlem was abuzz with whispers. The people knew. The word spread like wildfire. What had happened at Table 7 was no longer just a story. It was a legend in the making. Bumpy Johnson, the man they all feared and respected, had shown once again that there was no room for betrayal in his world. Loyalty was law, and anyone who broke that law paid the price. But for Bumpy, it wasn't about the whispers. It wasn't about the fame, the notoriety, or the fear. It was about the code, the system he had spent years building. The justice he delivered wasn't a spectacle. It was a lesson, a way of life. When you cross Bumpy Johnson, you're not just crossing a man. You're crossing a code that governed the streets, a code that no amount of money or distance could erase. The day Jerome fell, Harlem took note, not just because of the bloodshed, but because of what it meant for the streets. The unspoken law of loyalty, forged in the fire of years of struggle, was reasserted, and anyone who even thought of crossing it knew the price was too steep. The stakes had been raised, and the consequences were clearer than ever. Bumpy didn't just maintain control over Harlem, he defined it. It wasn't through intimidation alone, but through the respect he commanded from both his allies and enemies. He was a man of few words, but the few words he did speak carried weight. His silence was as powerful as his actions. And when he spoke, when the razor flashed, it wasn't just a punishment, it was a reminder of the power he wielded, a reminder that in Harlem, loyalty was sacred. The events surrounding Jerome's betrayal solidified Bumpy's place in history. He was more than just a gangster. He was a symbol of something larger, a symbol of the unbreakable bond between respect, power, and loyalty. In the weeks that followed, people spoke not just about the man who had killed or the man who ruled. They spoke about the man who had created a legacy that would endure long after his time. Bumpy Johnson had transcended the streets. He had become the embodiment of justice in Harlem. Bumpy didn't seek out the spotlight. He didn't crave the recognition. But as word of Jerome's fate spread, so too did the understanding that Bumpy's reign was absolute. No one was untouchable, not even those who once thought they were family. The streets, the hustlers, the businessmen, everyone understood the power dynamics now. Bumpy didn't need to raise his voice. The consequences of betrayal had already spoken louder than any threat could. The respect Bumpy earned after that night wasn't just a result of his power. It was a reflection of his unwavering belief in the code he upheld. He didn't have to remind anyone of his strength. The very air in Harlem seemed to shift when he entered a room. He wasn't just a figure of authority. He was a living legend, a force that had shaped the streets he walked. As for the men who worked with Bumpy, the loyalty that ran through his crew was unshakable. They had seen what happened when that loyalty was tested. And they knew exactly what would happen to anyone who tried to break it. In the face of betrayal, Bumpy had acted swiftly and decisively, not out of anger, but because it was necessary. It was the only way to maintain order. The streets had to have their code, and Bumpy was the enforcer of that code. The story of Bumpy Johnson's revenge wasn't just about a single act of retribution. It was about the power of loyalty, the cost of betrayal, and the enduring legacy of a man who had mastered both. It was a story that resonated beyond the streets of Harlem and echoed in every corner of the world, that understood what it meant to live by a code. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a gangster. He was a man who stood for something greater. He was a man who understood that power could only be wielded when it was anchored in loyalty, and that respect wasn't something you could buy. It had to be earned. The lessons of that night at Table 7 were clear. Betrayal comes with a cost, and justice, no matter how harsh, is always served. Bumpy didn't just enforce the law, he embodied it. His legacy, forged in the fires of loyalty and power, was never meant to be broken. It was a legacy that would live on long after he was gone, a legacy that defined an era and shaped the streets that had once feared him. For the people of Harlem, the story wasn't just a cautionary tale, it was a truth. Betrayal, no matter how long it takes, will always find its way back, and when it does, the price is steep. As Bumpy Johnson's story lives on, so does the code he built. The lesson he imparted to the streets is still alive today. There is no escaping the consequences of betrayal, not in his world. And sometimes, the greatest justice comes not from the law, but from the razor's edge. The razor that cuts through the lies, through the betrayal, and through the chaos, leaving only the truth in its wake. this wasn't just about one man's pride. It was about a community's dignity. And sometimes it takes a legend like Bumpy Johnson to remind the world what loyalty, respect, and justice really mean.